All right, so today I'm trying out a new microphone, so no headphones, and I get to sit back a little more, so all of my hand gestures are going to actually be caught on camera. Uh, we're going through two pieces today, very short, neither one particularly a deep dive into them. We're gonna cover first. I'm gonna mispronounce this name. Kazushi's Nojima's Final Fantasy VII on the way to a smile, and second is going to be that piece I mentioned last week. It was an essay by Leslie Fiedler. Here's the full reader. We did not read the whole thing. The initial essay is about 8 pages, titled Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey. We'll go over them in one at a time. Again, we're just reading some shorter things while I'm doing some more serious reading for other projects unrelated to these book reports. So first, we're covering it's it's first we're covering On the Way to a Smile, just because it was a nice, quick, light read. I've had this book for a while and I haven't read it. It's got fairly pretty art, so not bad for what you're expecting you're going to get from this. So I said last week that I thought it was going to be bad, and so I'll be upfront that I was wrong. It was surprisingly good for a video game tie-in novel, and okay, that's not really right, because it's a collection of short stories that came out prior to Advent Children. I've never watched Advent Children, so maybe if I had seen that, because the few people I've talked to have said that it was good, maybe I would have had higher expectations going in. But either way, it's a collection of these short stories, and that actually helps, I think, because honestly, none of the stories in there are really deep enough to carry a whole novel, and so I think it helps that we sort of trimmed them down into just the important bits. The book also does something that the game had trouble doing, specifically focusing in on a lot of the side characters. Anytime you have another medium that tries to ride off a game's popularity, there's sort of two ways it can go wrong. One is if it hews too closely to the source material. For example, if you read a lot of Dungeons and Dragon fiction, sometimes it tries to take itself seriously, and when it does that, but then it starts using all of the shorthand and lingo from the rules in the game, like classes, levels, spell circles, spell levels. We as players understand that that jargon is there so that we understand the rules of the world, but it throws off the fiction when people start saying I'm a level 5 ranger or something close to that. It's We'll go back to what C.S. Lewis said, right? That there's rules of the fictional world that we'll buy into, but some of those rules that we see in things like a lot of video game materials is by hewing too closely to that video game fiction, the set of rules needed for whatever other media they're translating to doesn't work. The short stories do a really good job of winking at the fact that, yeah, this was a game and materia and potions are kind of a goofy concept. They're part of the world, accept it, but don't think too hard about how that would affect the real world of the novel. Accept they exist and move on, because they're not part of the fiction of the world of the story we're trying to tell. The second problem is, instead of going too close to the source material, is if they try to stray too far from the source material. And none of the short stories really do that, right? They don't shy away from the fact, we have this whole storyline of the life stream and Mako and all of that. They don't ignore it. In fact, they make a key part of several of the stories, and the interquels, or whatever you want to call them, between each of the short stories. It's part of the Final Fantasy expanded universe, or whatever you want to call it, compilation. I forget what their official term is. And honestly, it does what it sets out to do. It gives you short stories of characters you're interested in and care about, and gives you new insight into them. And honestly, the only real flaw is the same flaw you get with any connected fiction, that if you can't really just jump into this without having played the game. It doesn't work. Like, I don't even think they give you physical descriptions of the characters. Now maybe you could say they don't need it because they have, the art of who all of these people are, but it's very clearly that either that was a stylistic choice because, hey, people have already played the game, they don't need to know physically what these people look like, but it might just have been, I don't want to say an oversight, but just they're leaning on the fact that you have this whole visual media and iconography that you know who Cloud is. You don't need them to give you any of that information. It's also a very breezy set of stories. I kind of mentioned I read this in maybe a couple of hours one day, and so you're not losing a whole lot of time if you try to if you do go to read it. Overall, it really works, and the only thing that I think really stood out to me is that there's one character who just sort of jumps in from I think it's like a Japanese phone game, who the novel, the short story expects you to know who that is, and they don't give you the explanation, so it's a little weird. But again, that's just a problem you're going to get with any sort of sequel or connected fiction. They expect you to know what's going on. So I'd say, again, worth reading if this is a series you're interested in. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, so even if you end up not liking it, not a huge investment. So one thing I also want to note, because I think before the last two book reviews we did were more book reports, right? We kind of broke down Beauvoir or Lewis's arguments and sort of walked our way through them to, see the connecting logic or the through line of the argument. And this is more of just a review as opposed to a report. And I think one key thing to talk about whenever you give a review of something is, your general approach to reviews. And I am an incredibly easy grader because I know it's hard to do good things. So when I'm looking at something on whether I'm going to recommend it, I'm a very easy grader. I look for multiple things, right? Did the author try and did the author care are two big pieces of what I'm looking for. There's one of the early Mystery Science Theater episodes, I think, where Joel says they just didn't care, and that strikes out to me a lot worse than errors in continuity, or if the world doesn't make internal consistent sense. And those are important things, but it's not nearly as important to me as did the author try, did the author care, is the author succeeding at evoking the emotions that it appears that their story intends to appeal to, right? Is it fun to read, as in just, is it easy to read, not necessarily as in is it not dense, but do they do weird things with language but for a purpose? There was one book that was written entirely in second person. I can't remember the title, and that just did not appeal to me. But I saw what the author was trying to do, so I still this was years ago. I was at the time, I was like, yeah, no, I see what the author was trying to do. Didn't work for me, but I liked it. So if you look at all of those things that I just said I look at before deciding whether to recommend something or not, is it good? Doesn't really come up, right? I'm very rarely making a qualitative judgment. It's very much like, do I think this is worth your time to decide, for you to invest in, to come to your own decision of whether this is good or bad? It comes back to what Lewis said about, you have to surrender to a work before you know if it was worth surrendering to said work. And that's the same thing I do when I'm trying to recommend something to someone. Is this worth your time? Doesn't necessarily mean it's good. It just means I think whoever did this work, they did well at it, as in they did what they were trying to do with what they had available, and they have earned your time to try and win you over. So this is partially why I'm a notoriously easy grader, and I often am going to find joy in things that are notoriously garbage, Like if the internet tells you something's garbage, I'll probably look at it and I'll be like, no, I think it was, fun. It was interesting. The team, the author, whoever tried to do this, and it may have may work for you. It may not. So I'm the reason you can't get nice things in cinema or in books, because I like bad things, essentially. But either way, I think that's important for people to know when taking any review into account. And so when I say, I think if you're in the target audience, because again, this isn't something just anyone can pick up and read, but if you've played the game, which most people who are going to have, clicked on this link have, worth your time. A few hours, maybe you end up hating it. There's a few things in here that I was like, that was a goofy choice, but still, overall, worth your time. The second thing that we're going to talk about is a little more literary, I guess you could say, is Leslie Fiedler's Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey, which I read and I was going to talk about because I kind of mentioned it in passing when talking about C.S. Lewis's Lewis mentioned Huckleberry Finn, and I was like, this one paragraph was more insightful than the entire essay that Fiedler wrote on it. And I was basing that off of my memory of having read this essay, like 12, 13 years ago. And I was like, maybe I'm being unfair, uncharitable, because it was a long time ago. Let me reread the essay so that I can now give a more informed view, because I wanted to be fair. And so I did. I went back, reread it. Here's what I think. First, I thought that this essay was much longer. I thought it was longer as in like the Should We Burn Babar essay. That was really like a 20-ish page thing. And so the first thing I thought when I looked at it was like, it's only 8 or 9 pages. I was like, clearly I'm misremembering a lot about this. So I was like, okay. So I'm glad I went back so I can, clear up what I thought was wrong with it. And I'm going to be upfront, I'm not very big on discussing things like poetry or literary theory in depth, just because it's interesting, but things like symbolism and themes are stuff that's interesting to talk about, but only with people who are actually interested in that and want to talk about it. And so it's very hard to just sort of get on a soapbox and lecture on it, which I know is weird considering we did several months and a week of book reviews on the ethics of ambiguity and C.S. Lewis's The Reading Life. But I want that just sort of up front here, just because I'm already predisposed to just not like this essay, because it's not something I generally care to go out of my way to read. But I did read it, and so we're gonna go over what I thought. And the first thing, originally when I wrote my notes, my first criticism was like, oh, this is going to be a fairly minor style point, that the title doesn't really work for me, because Fiedler doesn't really talk a whole lot about Huckleberry Finn. And then I realized that, no, this is actually the crux of what I was talking about last week, and why I'm glad I went back to read it, because my main annoyance with how often people would bring up this essay was because they're using it as talking about how people who discuss literary theory try to read themes that aren't there into things. Look at Fiedler's work and how he was trying to read into Huck and Jim's relationship something that isn't there. And that's a fair criticism if you look at the title, you vaguely remember the essay, but if you go back and read it, even Fiedler at one point says, now, this might have just been, Mark Twain put Jim in a wedding dress because putting people in uncomfortable, awkward situations is funny, and that may all be all it was. And so Fiedler doesn't even really push the Huckleberry Finn part of the argument in this essay very hard. And so this title doesn't work for me, because after reading it, a larger portion of Fiedler's essay is about Moby Dick. So let's first talk about what is the essay really about, right? Because I've been talking about it and didn't really get into it. On rereading it, Fiedler's thesis isn't too strongly about literature in general, because he doesn't really get to that for a couple of pages. He's talking about society and the views that were being held on homosexuals, African Americans, other minorities. And he says if you look in books in the past, you can see these sorts of archetypes appearing. And the one that he really drills down on and focuses on is Queequeg, and I probably pronounced that wrong. I think that's how they pronounce the name for the dog in X-Files, so we're just going to assume that pronunciation is right. So he talks more about Ishmael and Queequeg than about Huckleberry Finn. And on reading this essay, I'm like, okay, I can actually see this argument that he's making, because even though it may not be a strong argument, I haven't read Moby Dick in probably equally a long time, 10, 15 years, and unlike an 8-page essay, I'm not going to go back and read that just to make this second jump to understanding this, right? I did, however, that comes back to my point where my initial memory of this essay was so off, because no one talks about it in relation to Moby Dick in general, because the title misdirects you into talking about Huckleberry Finn. And that's unfortunate, because that's a much weaker argument that Fiedler even kind of, I don't want to say leaves on the field or passes by, but it's not the one he focuses on, and so I think it's unfair to his argument to focus on that. So let's kind of move on, because I feel like I'm going to get into this loop. The first page and a half, maybe 3 pages, is really more of this social critique we were talking about earlier. Huckleberry Finn and Moby Dick are tossed in as examples of what Fiedler calls boys' books, different than what Lewis was referring to as boys or girls' books, which were school stories, right? He means these are books written with a target audience of young boys, as opposed to this is a story about boys in school, in boarding schools, which was Lewis's meaning, which, again, unnecessary sidetrack here. So Fiedler is talking about the importance of what he's seeing as these relationships, either romantic or not. And for Fiedler, he's kind of at one point mentions that there's the idea of here's a quote, a child's version of the Scarlet Letter would seem a far-fetched joke if it were not part of our common experience, because Fiedler is acknowledging, yeah, we teach the Scarlet Letter to kids, but it seems really odd to Fiedler because what is called the American idea of innocence is everything goes except the frank description of adult heterosexual love. Because, this is I may be misreading this because, again, I think this was written in the late 60s, early 70s. I know I didn't write a lot of strong notes on this one. And reading it from this modern 2021 view, I'm looking back and I'm like, oh, that's, all the people who are like, you can shoot as many people as you want and you'll get a PG-13 rating. But if you put sex in a movie, you're going to get an R most likely. And that's, I think, underplaying what Fiedler is saying here. I think that might be an unfair, glib interpretation, but we're trying to breeze through this. So the Scarlet Letter stands out to Fiedler because it does address these issues, and he goes on to say, to back up his view that, minorities and homosexuals are being portrayed in literature, but they're being portrayed in this specific archetypal way. And so Fiedler says, as boys' books, we should expect them, boys' books, to shyly, guiltlessly, as it were, to proffer a chaste male's love as the ultimate emotional experience. And when you read that, and that's a quote that you see associated with this, you look at the title Come Closer on the Raft, and you look at Huckleberry Finn, the argument doesn't fit there, right? Like, even from a modern view, you're looking at it and you're like, I don't see, your argument's not connecting. And that's because Fiedler doesn't really try and connect it too hard to Huckleberry Finn. He's pulling quotes for a majority of this. Well, not a majority of this. For a portion of this from Moby Dick to support this argument. And honestly, again, I haven't read it, so I went to, took his quotes, went to Gutenberg, and they had a copy of Moby Dick. I guess it's in the public domain. It's got to be if it's on Gutenberg, right? Looked up the quotes to just make sure he wasn't, pulling them out of context. And while he does do a little bit where he, takes a quote from chapter 4, uses some ellipses to jump to chapter 10, that's fair, I think, because this isn't meant to be a deep literary criticism. It's a social criticism using literature as, the framing device here. And the reason I say I think it's fair is because this is meant for a 8 or 9 page essay, so he doesn't have time to trace Ishmael and Queequeg's relationship from, where do they meet? They meet at like I don't want to call it a boarding house. They meet at an inn. They meet at a tavern, they smoke a little bit, and then they're like, oh yeah, we're both going on a whaling boat. And like, he doesn't have time to trace that all the way through Moby Dick. So he's going and picking out the quotes that support the argument he's trying to make. And yeah, he does have to go from chapter 4 where he talks about the two of them like falling asleep together in the hold of a boat, and Ishmael wakes up and Queequeg has gone from like trying to sleep as far away as possible to like what is it? Is it Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, the movie? Where same sort of thing, only here it's not being, Fiedler isn't saying it's being played for laughs, it's like this building of a relationship. And even if you don't agree with Fiedler's read of Moby Dick, you at least have to give him credit here that this is at least a valid reading of it, right? You might be like, I don't think that's what Melville meant. But that's taking, and again, I hate talking about literary theory. You're making an argument there from the author's meaning is what matters. Fiedler, maybe he does think that Melville meant it this way. I don't know. It didn't really come out in the essay, or it did, and I'm just too dumb to have noticed it. But Fiedler is basically, let's give him the benefit of the doubt that he's not going to try and assert he knows what Melville meant. He's asserting a death of the author. This is what Fiedler feels from reading this. He gives a little reasons to back up. It's not just pure feeling like I'm making it sound. And it's a decent argument, right? I say he like jumps dishonestly from chapter 4 to 10, but I think that's unfair to say that it's a dishonest jump because, like I said, he's only got like 8 pages to play with here, so he's going to have to be doing some ellipses. I would have liked if he was like, in chapter 4 we have this, later on in chapter 10 we have this, or chapter 3, chapter 4, like if he did that. But again, also remember who Fiedler's audience is. It's other people who are doing literary theory, literary reading. He's not writing for me who hasn't read Moby Dick in 15 years. He's writing for people who are intimately aware of Moby Dick, these discussions that Fiedler is having, and they are aware that, oh yeah, I know where that quote came from, I know where that one, they don't need to do what I did and go to Project Gutenberg and control F the quotes and be like, you're jumping around here. But again, even though he is, it's still a valid reading. So I think me saying it's a dishonest quoting is more, it's more like the difference is in plagiarism, right? Like it's, like, I think it was done out of laziness, not malice. And even laziness isn't right here. That's way too negative of a read. He had only so much space, word counts at a premium, and the people he's talking to already know where he's going with this. So I don't even think that's a fair comparison. But it's important to sort of explain my reasoning why I'm like, okay, I get it. Because he jumps from chapter 4, from that story to chapter 10 or 11, where is where Queequeg says, and henceforth we were married. Now, of course, anyone who's trying to argue that this isn't what Melville meant does point out, like, well, in the next sentence, what Ishmael says is that, and what Queequeg meant was that we were bosom friends. But Fiedler's basically saying, like, don't believe that, look at everything else. So again, I think that here is a pretty solid argument for what Fiedler's trying to argue. You can disbelieve, you can disagree, but it's a valid argument, and it's not the reaching that we see with Huckleberry Finn, which is the same reason that Fiedler even says, "Hey, maybe that one's just Mark Twain on a lark." But this comes back to, I don't know why this essay gets brought up when people talk about Huckleberry Finn, because it's such a small part of the essay as a whole, and it does a disservice to Fiedler's essay. And one of the reasons I'm spending so much time on this is because I misremembered it, and when I go back and I read it, despite my loathing of literary theory, I get what he's saying. And honestly, not knowing a lot about Melville as a person, maybe Fiedler is making a solid argument I would agree with if I, went and read some biographies of Melville. Maybe if I went ahead and like read his personal letters, maybe I'd be like, no, I think maybe that is what he was trying to say. But that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this, and why it conveniently sort of linked up with On the Way to a Smile, because one of the important things you should take away when listening to anyone about criticism is if they can sit here and be like, hey, I was wrong 2 for 2. Here's why. Here's, what I thought. Here's what I did. And you know what? I was wrong. And that, I think, is something important for people to be able to do. So maybe you should go back, and if you know what this Fiedler essay is, and this isn't all just gobbledygook to you, go back and read it, and maybe you're going to realize, oh, hey, what I remembered was way different than what was there. The essay isn't trying to make the critique of Huckleberry Finn that the people who made you read this essay may have been pushing. Or at least the author isn't making that argument as strongly. And it's probably a flaw with what was picked as the title, right? So I think if you reread it, I hope that you'll walk away with a different view than what you may have had from your vague rememberings of what this was. I don't know what our next book report's going to be, mainly because, like I said, it'll matter how much non-work related reading I get done over the next week. But there we go. You've listened to me go for maybe 25-30 minutes about just how utterly wrong I was about everything. So thank you for listening.